welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled you're joining us today because, well, we have a truly fascinating piece of writing to unpack together. Usually when we talk about a broken marriage, we expect raw, unfiltered emotion, right? Maybe some tears, definitely a whole lot of venting. But today we're going to dive into how a poet uses literal science, mathematics, and structured data to decode the incredibly messy reality of a marital split. The text we're looking at is called The Chemistry of Marital Dissolution. Okay, let's jump right into this and see exactly how cold, hard facts can capture the absolute deepest, most complex human heartbreak.
Right out of the gate, I want to hit you with this incredibly jarring phrase straight from the text: piss orange melancholy. Man, it hits you right between the eyes, doesn't it? Before we even get into any kind of clinical analysis, the poet just throws this hyper-specific, super visceral image at us. And it really makes you wonder, how exactly can a complex, devastating emotion like melancholy be perfectly mapped to such a specific, unpleasant color? Keep this phrase tucked away in the back of your mind, because it is the exact destination this entire explainer is driving toward today. All right, let's start with Section 1, the law of dissolution, defining the break. Now, what's really interesting here is the deliberate choice of vocabulary. The poet doesn't start by talking about a breakup or even a divorce. They specifically ground us in the sterile, clinical terminology of Minnesota law, where a divorce is officially called a dissolution of marriage. Just think about that word for a second. Dissolution. It sounds like something happening in a beaker, in some sterile laboratory, right? Completely devoid of human feeling, messiness, or history. It's framed as a legal mechanism, pure and simple. But literally immediately, the poet shatters that sterile legal illusion. A dissolution might sound like a neat and tidy legal process on paper, but the reality, it's weary and just deeply exhausting. It is, as the poet points out, way more complicated than getting married, because, sure, building a life with someone takes genuine effort, but untangling the legal, financial, and physical reality of two completely intertwined lives, the law makes it sound so clean, but the lived reality is an absolute labyrinth of complications. Moving on to Section 2. The chemistry of solutions, saltwater and syrup. Since the legal definition of dissolution hints at things dissolving, the poet takes that idea entirely literally. Let's look at the first chemical reaction they use to explain marriage. You take water and you add a basic solid, like table salt. Two completely separate things merge and become one brand new entity, salt water. It's got a different flavor and it's much more buoyant. Maybe it even lifts you up in a way you weren't before. But here's the melancholic catch. This new solution is not as satisfying to the thirst as pure water. The marriage changes you. It makes you a new compound, but it doesn't necessarily quench your deepest fundamental needs. So the absolutely crucial point is what happens when that union finally ends. When the liquid of the relationship evaporates over a long period of time, what remains? Well, the poet tells us you are left with just the basic element: salt. You set that bitter glass aside, and you are left as something useful and salty. It's a really profound, striking way to describe the lingering bitterness and the hardened utility someone might feel after a long relationship just entirely dries up. But the poet gives us another example of a chemical solution, actually reminding us of our very first lessons in cooking. Take 1 part water and 1 part sugar. You heat it over a medium burner until the sugar liquefies, perfectly becoming one with the water. It's kind of like magic. You've created simple syrup. It's sweet, it's highly useful, and unless you spill it on the counter and create a total sticky disaster, it perfectly represents those euphoric, sugary early days of merging your life completely with someone else's. And then, right in the middle of this brisk educational recipe for simple syrup, the poet drops this, just tucked quietly into parentheses. He left me years ago. It completely stops you in your tracks, doesn't it? We're sitting here talking about boiling sugar on a stove, and suddenly, the raw, bleeding reality of the timeline is just whispered to us. It changes the entire context of that sweet syrup just sitting idly on the shelf. Because that simple syrup doesn't just stay magically sweet forever. As the poet notes, this sweet union is often overindulged. It basically caters to the 7 deadly sins. When a relationship is built entirely on consuming sweetness, and it's seldom left sitting on the shelf long enough to naturally separate, it becomes destructive. It gets toxic. It ends, as the poet starkly puts it, in morbid obesity. The very thing that made it magic in the beginning is exactly what eventually suffocates it. Next up is Section 3, the math of separation, when 1 + 1 = 4.
So law failed to capture the reality, and chemistry showed us how things merge and eventually turn bitter or toxic. Now, the poet looks at the idealized new math of those simple chemical solutions. The marriage vows dictate that one person plus one person miraculously equals one unified entity. But the poet admits this math completely confuses them. Because in the messy, on-the-ground reality of their specific breakup, their math looks entirely different. 1 plus 1 somehow equals 4. The numbers simply do not add up. The collateral damage has multiplied way far beyond the two people who initially stood there and took those vows. That brings us to Section 4, the Gordian Knot, Mythological Entanglements. When modern science, precise mathematics, and state laws all completely fail to provide answers, where do you turn? You turn back to antiquity. They describe their situation as a Gordian knot. Now, if you aren't familiar with the myth, a Gordian knot is a legendary puzzle, an impossibly intricate knot that couldn't be untied by human hands, and was famously solved by Alexander the Great simply taking his sword and slicing it right in half. But the poet quickly points out that human lives aren't ancient myths. This situation isn't a simple action of dissolving into tears with a sudden resolution. You literally cannot simply take a sword and cleanly slice through the discord of a modern marriage, because the knots in this divorce are actively binding four people together. To reach the heart of the original two, to truly divide the original union, you have to navigate the tangled, bleeding connections of four distinct individuals. It is an impossible, mythological puzzle playing out right there in a modern living room. This leads us to what I honestly believe is the absolute thesis statement of the entire explainer, captured so perfectly by the poet, sometimes dissolution takes more than divorce. The legal stamp from the state of Minnesota, the divorce itself is just an event. It happens on a Tuesday. But the dissolution, the emotional unraveling of the salt water, the simple syrup, the Gordian knot, that takes years. It is an ongoing, grueling process that outlasts the legal paperwork entirely. And finally, Section 5, the Pantone color chart mapping the intangibles. If the rigid academic sciences of law, chemistry, and math ultimately falls short in explaining this pain, what's actually left? The poet introduces us to a chart of what they call beautiful intangibles. We instinctively assign colors to these wonderful floating feelings that existed within the relationship, right? Pink equals love, yellow equals happiness, red equals passion. As a society, we are super comfortable charting and categorizing the beautiful, uplifting parts of human connection. But that poses a massive question, one that brings our entire analysis full circle today. If love, happiness, and passion get beautiful primary colors, where do the ugly intangibles go? Where do we categorize the deep betrayal, the bitterness of the evaporated salt, the toxicity of the overindulged sugar? Where do those live? The poet delivers this incredibly powerful, grounding realization. They are on the Pantone color chart too. The ugly emotions don't exist in some dark void outside of human experience. They are right there in the book. They're real, they're identifiable, and they are just as vividly colored as the love and the happiness. Which brings us right back to the jarring imagery we opened with, piss orange melancholy. It isn't just a random, gross phrase. It is a meticulously chosen swatch on a massive, complex chart of grief. The poet has successfully mapped their complicated, lingering grief across a spectrum that the state laws of Minnesota, the chemistry of salt and water, and the strict rules of mathematics could never fully explain. Heartbreak has its own vibrant, ugly, totally undeniable color palette. We've seen how a poet can use the clinical tools of science and data to expose the raw nerves of a failed marriage, ending in a spectrum of incredibly specific emotional colors. So I really want to leave you with this final provocative thought today. If the ugly intangibles of life have their very own exact color codes, what color is your most complicated emotional knot? Think about it. Thank you so much for exploring this brilliantly structured text with me today, and hey, keep looking for the hidden structures in the messy parts of life.